it's a general overview for what is the practice of science, how do people actually go about doing science, and how we consume that information and how it gets implemented in different ways. It's very important. So trying to give a general overview, and then ultimately some tips and tricks that'll hopefully help make the process of using the internet and navigating the endless internet to find what you decide are reliable sources, make that process a little easier for you. I'm going to be following along with the PowerPoint that I made for most of the presentation. So here we go. Everybody see that?
Looks good, Taylor.
All right. So ultimately, you know, there's plenty of issues very current that people appreciate, that it is vital that we have a better understanding of science, or the science that is being used to make different claims. But beyond that, it's just simply the case that we live in a world that is completely changed by science. And it's not just used for politics and economics, but it's used in the media for all kinds of different reasons. This is just a taste of the application of science in our world today, both for very legitimate reasons, very illegitimate ones that are just fun, ones that are much more serious. So it's important that we have some basic comprehension of what science is, because it's all around us. And this, more than anything, this is one of the biggest points that I want to stress, is that science is ultimately a process and a practice. There's all kinds of phrases thrown around to say, you know, science has proven that, or well, science says this, as if there is a single individual or governing body that declares, yes, this is official science. No, that is not official science. And that's not the case at all. Science is the scientific method, and many, many people all over the world practice it. And it's basically a cooperative process in which we understand that we're vetting each other. And the more that we do that, the more we can be confident about the accuracy of what our experiments are showing us. This next point, science does not prove anything. Of course, we use the findings from the scientific process to come to a lot of different conclusions and make decisions about how we're going to shape the world around us and how we're going to live our lives. But there's a very important, what I see as humility ingrained within the scientific process, which asserts the idea that if you're doing proper science, you're never trying, first of all, you're never trying to definitively prove something. It's not a good process. It's not a good process to go into it saying, I think the world is this way. I think the world is X. Therefore, I need to construct an experiment that will prove my point. There's going to be all kinds of bias implicit in such an experiment. So the much better approach to get closer and more accurate to the reality of what's happening around you or what you're trying to observe is, you can make predictions, but ultimately you are trying to just collect information. And the more information we collect and the more that we can compare information between individuals, the closer we can get to that reality. We're never trying to, there's never a single research experiment that will ever definitively prove anything. It's about building, as I say here, it's about collecting evidence, it's about building a case for or against a hypothesis. And so even with something that seems common knowledge, a scientific discovery that has been in effect for generations, if we're being technical and proper, we would never say that it's been definitively proven. We would just say that for all of recorded history, you know, every experiment or observation has has given us the same results or given us similar results, such that we can assume with a very high degree of certainty that it will continue to be that way. A really basic example would be something like gravity. It seems like, well, of course that's the way it is, but science would never definitively say this is the way that it is. It's always coming from a place of skepticism and humility of this is the best answer we have at this time, which helps us always be open to new and potential information. When somebody comes along and does some different kind of research or does the same research and produces new results that we have to look at and potentially synthesize into our understanding of the world. As I mentioned, science requires cooperation and consensus. There's never any definitive individual or definitive experiment that is going to be the single source of justification or evidence that we would use to make large changes in the world or invent new technologies. It's always built upon the work of many, many people. Even in a famous example, someone that, like a scientist that is well known and held in high esteem, like Einstein. Einstein's credited for the theories that he came up with, the theory of relativity. But even when he first posited the idea, there were a lot of scientists in the scientific community that were not hip to the idea, were not on board, did not think he was accurate, and it took time for other people within the scientific community to study his research, to replicate his research, and to come to the same conclusion on their own, and also to expand that research. A very common way that research is justified or replicated or backed up is by scientists expanding one step beyond it. So, you might have a scientist and say, I have found, based off this research, I have found, or it seems to be the case that, stars of this type always produce this kind of light or this kind of radiation. I'm giving a specific example, but it could be anything. Just like, I have found X to be the case. And then another scientist can come along and say, if X were the case, I should expect to see this other thing happening in this different situation. And by doing research on that, they can help build a case towards the original research of, yes, X is the case, or no, it doesn't seem that X is the case because we would have seen these other things occurring if that was so. So it's the conclusions that science comes to, however final they are built upon the work of many, many people, and they are constantly being reinforced or not. Nothing is set in stone. And this is just another point of, it's important that we appreciate and understand this process because it truly has shaped the world that we live in and continues to very dramatically. So, all right. So first of all, let's talk about the process itself. Oh, this quote. And anything like quotes that I have in here, we can get later. I'm not going to read the full thing to you. It's by the famous science educator, Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's basically, I appreciate it because it speaks again to the humility that needs to be inherent in good science. And it's basically making the point that as scientists, we appreciate that the basic functions of our body, our basic senses, what we see, what we smell, what we hear, is a very limited bit or very limited parameters through which the world can be seen. There's all kinds of things that our bodies on their own are not aware of, that through research and technology, we are now aware. Using our eyes, for example, the amount of the electromagnetic spectrum that's visible to us is a very, very small amount. And at this point, we understand that there is much more diversity in frequency from both sides of, microwave radiation, for example. And we have tools that can go beyond our senses to help us understand the world around us. So it's important that we have methods and tools because our basic perception is not enough to get the full picture. So it's worth us taking the time to design specific methods and parameters so that we can try and get that bigger picture. We can step beyond ourselves, not just our basic senses as humans, but also our awareness and senses as individuals. Step beyond ourselves and work together to make these advancements. So here's the basic scientific process, the scientific method. This is as it's taught in schools, even down to young kids. That if you're teaching it to elementary school, you should probably take out a couple steps and make it a little more simplistic. But it's still the basic idea that we all learned back then, just that you have a question, something is going on in the world around you and you want to know more about it. The second step from the top there is a very important one, which I think it tends to be omitted in visuals of the scientific method, but I think it's a very important one, and it's doing background research. Because lots of the time, if you have any kind of question about the world, odds are you are not the first person to have had this question or to have had a very similar question. So before you go out and, as a scientist in whatever capacity, before you go out designing your own hypothesis and experiment and going through all this trouble, look at what's already been done out there. And if you are going to do any kind of research on your own, build off of the work of previous people. But so from that question you had, you construct a hypothesis. The most basic idea of a hypothesis is it's an if-then statement. If X and then Y. You're positing an idea of, I think that the world works this way, or I think that this thing will react in this way when I stimulate it or whatever. And then you have to design an experiment with parameters that will accurately test your idea. Again, along that idea of humility, most researchers are very actively in designing their experiment, trying to prove their hypothesis wrong, because that is usually the fastest way to get to a conclusion as to whether or not your hypothesis was correct. So again, we're not going into it with any inherent bias of like, I have an idea and I want my idea to be right. So I'll use an experiment to try and show that it's right or try and find that it's right. No, it's about, I have an idea, let me do everything I can through an experiment to prove that idea wrong, to tear it apart. And then only if I cannot do that, then I will start to have an idea of, okay, I'm on the right track. Let me experiment with this idea more. So we have this process of experimenting. Of course, we have the areas where it's looping back over itself here, the idea that we're troubleshooting. After we run an experiment, it's important that we not just examine the results, whatever data that we collect, but we need to examine the whole experiment. Is there anything about the procedure that we didn't pick up on before that we realize now, oh, that's going to be a huge problem, and it makes the results inaccurate. And so we have to repeat the experiment and fine tune it and troubleshoot it. But whatever the case, hopefully we get to some kind of conclusion down here where we are analyzing data that we collect and we draw a conclusion. And of course, even when those, as here, results align partially or not at all with the hypothesis, then it's just back to the drawing board kind of idea. But so even when we come to a conclusive idea, even if to whatever extent that we can create, it seems that the results from the research lines up with our hypothesis. That doesn't mean that we're done. And the last step here, communicate the results, is just as importantly as if we think we're right, we want other people to know the idea and work off of it. But we're communicating the results to put the information out there for other people to test and other people to question it. Because even if we have been as rigorous and thorough as we can, and as critical of ourselves and our own process as we can, there's always the chance that we missed something or we didn't think about something. And so we're communicating those results to basically say, hey, this is what I found. Can somebody else work on this as well? Can somebody else do this again and back me up? get the same results essentially. So it's a never-ending process. All right, we're going to go through a handful of terminology. Hopefully it's all familiar to whatever extent, but refreshers are always good. So bear with me here. These first couple ones are big ones though, and it's because there are definitions within the scientific community that are not the same definitions as the general public uses. So these words get thrown around a lot, especially through the media in a scientific context, when they're not necessarily using it accurately. So first of all, a fact. What is a fact within science? The key here is that it is an observation, an objective, verifiable observation. It has to be something so basic that with our basic senses, we can all confirm it. Or I'm sorry, not necessarily with our basic senses. If, let's say it's something so small that we can't see it, but if we can set up a microscope and we can have any number of people come through and look through that microscope and all say the same thing of like, yes, that is a plant cell, or even if it is something we can see with our basic senses. If I walked everybody through a room and I pointed at a chair and I said, what is that? And I got everybody to say, that is a chair, that is a chair. We have consensus, and it is verified through the consent. Our observation is verified through the consensus. Next, we have a law. A law kind of is the next step from those facts. It's a statement that uses facts about the world around us to usually make predictions, usually to say, I've noticed this occurring, therefore I think there's a pattern and I anticipate that this next thing is going to occur. A common example with a lot of old world scientists was different discoveries in astronomy, basically through observations of being able to say, I've been looking at the sun every single day. I've been tracking its motion. I have found that it moves. I have found that it moves with specific patterns throughout the year. And because of that, I can predict that on this date, at this time, the sun will be at this point in the sky. Note that that is a good example because you would use mathematics to prove that. And laws are often mathematical statements, some kind of proof, or other means of through numbers showing the probability of an event occurring. But most of the earliest laws that were formed were about very common universal norms in the world, like the motion of the sun, the moon, and the stars throughout the course of the year, temperature fluctuations throughout the different seasons. So it's definitely taking the next step because it's showing that we don't just have facts, we don't just have observations, we're able to take those observations and weave them into ideas about how the world around us is operating. And again, a law is just a prediction, but usually it's one that gets, if it's correct or if it's accurate rather, it gets proven time and time again. And that is the case with many astronomical events today that, you know, whether it's the motion of the sun or the exact dates and times of eclipses, we truly, to use the phrase, we truly have it down to a science at this point, because these laws, these mathematical statements predicting these different events have been made, they've been proven to be accurate, and they continue to be proven accurate. So we'll use them until a better statement comes up. A hypothesis, as we already mentioned, this is your idea. This is the proposition of, I think the world works this way. I think if X, then Y, or I think because of X, Y. This is the untested idea, or it is the new idea that emerges out of the test or experiment that was performed. And here's the big one, theory. The quote at the bottom, I think, just does a nice succinct job of going over all these terms. Theory is the big one that we hear thrown around all the time in all kinds of different contexts. And of course, it's usually used disparagingly, because in the general lexicon, we will use it in a phrase of like, well, it's just a theory, as if to say it's just an idea or it's just a hunch that I had. However, in the scientific community, theory is a very specific word, and it is built off of the work of many scientists. It is a hypothesis that has been tested time and time again by many different individuals, in a similar way to the law, such that we have built consensus not because any one individual has definitively proven something, but because we're saying many people have approached this problem from different angles or the same angle, repeating the exact same experiment, and we have gotten the exact same or very similar results every single time. Every person, wherever they are, whatever time they did the experiment, we get the same thing. And so it is the best answer that we currently have, or the best idea that we currently have, to explain a phenomena in the world. So within the scientific community, something is never just a theory. A theory is the work of many individuals over a long period of time, decades, if not generations, many times. So it is, a scientific theory is some of the most solid ideas that we have in the scientific community, and that the scientific community uses as a framework to build off of, to ask new questions and do new research.
Found that they take 9.
Say that again?
I think somebody just came in, that's all.
Oh, okay. So yeah, four very important terms, again, within the scientific community, very specific definitions. So we need to be aware of how the context in which these words are being used by different individuals as we traverse the world. And I have some examples here. So as was stated, I run the orchard here at Fox Haven, so I use apple trees as my examples. And for this first one, it's very apropos, because it works off of Newton's law of gravity. So I know that there are apple trees in my orchard. That's a fact, because it's a verifiable observation. Of course, there needs to be a little knowledge, so that we all understand the definition of what makes an apple tree. But as long as we all have a working definition, we can confidently, again, I can bring anybody into the orchard, I can point to the apple tree, ask what it is, and I can get confirmation that that is an apple tree. You know, maybe someone that doesn't have the knowledge would be able to confidently say that is a tree, and then if I take them out there at the right time of year when there are apples in the tree, then it will be a verifiable observation. Definitely an apple tree. Now the next step, inspired by Newton, is the law. I find that apples always fall down when they break off of the tree. They always fall down. They never fall up. They don't fall in some other direction. They don't float right in place. They fall down to the ground. Why is that? Well, it took Newton to come along and create the law of gravity, which basically he didn't have any significant observations. He wasn't doing a lot of experiments where he was timing different reactions or anything. He was working within the mathematical sphere, and he basically postulated the effect of different bodies within space and how with different masses they would pull towards each other or affect each other. And so he was thinking in this very abstract way for his time, but he was able to come up with this idea nonetheless that would explain, well, if my idea was right of how we're on this massive sphere and it has mass and it's pulling us towards it, then that would explain why apples fall from the tree. He's not definitively proving it. He's not giving an explanation. He doesn't have a hypothesis for why gravity is what it is. He's just saying we can observe this effect where things fall down. We will call that effect gravity. And here is the math to prove the way that it works. Here is a math that can help me predict if something falls or if something is to fall. If I know a little bit about it, like its size and its mass, I can make estimations of like how quickly will it fall and how big of an impact will it have when it will fall. We're not getting into the how, we're not getting into the why, just the how. It takes the next step, the theory of, in this case, it was Einstein's theory of relativity coming along. And of course, as we get more specific, the information can get a little more esoteric, usually because scientists are working in the frontier and they're coming up with new and weird words because we don't have words to explain these things. I bring that up because when I say the theory applied to my apple trees would be that the apples fall down off the tree due to their geodesic path. A geodesic path, the basic idea is it is a straight line drawn on a curved plane. So if you look at a globe, and the globe has lines of longitude and latitude, they are straight lines drawn on that curved surface, so they are geodesic paths. And Einstein expanded this idea to create the idea of space-time, and we can see lots of images and models out there that help us understand the idea of gravity and how things orbit around each other by showing space as a flat linear plane. And the heavier something is, the more it makes a curve in the plane. And so because there are curves in that plane, if we draw a line to show the path of an object, it will be a straight line on a curved plane. So that's where that term comes from. But basically the idea, the reason I am putting this in here is to expand up from the law of gravity, the mathematical statement that explains gravity is an effect and here is how the effect works, to an explanation of why did the effect occur in the first place. And that is the theory. So Einstein created a hypothesis, and when Einstein published papers on this idea, he did not title them the theory of relativity, because it was not a theory yet. It wasn't established. He was just positing an idea, a hypothesis, and he used a lot of mathematics to justify his hypothesis. However, again, his ideas weren't initially accepted. He didn't get standing ovations immediately after presenting his findings. It took the work of many other scientists reading what he had written, critiquing it, trying to disprove it every way they could, and only when they could not, and only when they found that it seemed to fit all of our current understanding of the world through different scientific laws, that yes, this seems to be accurate enough that we can reliably use it as a model to better understand the world around us. Therefore, because of that time spent studying it and the experience of many people, we can now call it the theory of relativity. Another example, this one gets into genetics. So a fact is that if I go into my orchard, if I take anybody into my orchard, we can visually see that the trees look different. Again, if we go the right time of year and there are apples on all the trees, we can all agree they're definitely apple trees. But even then, there are differences in these apple trees. Some of them take on much taller forms, some of them much wider. The apples themselves are different shapes and colors and sizes. So they're apple trees, but they're different. And maybe we find that some of these trees look more similar than others, so we kind of group them together visually. And again, this is all just fact. This is things that not only I can observe, but anybody that comes into that same space can observe. So moving beyond that, we get a law. We get the idea that, well, maybe trees that are directly related to each other are more similar. Maybe that's why some of the trees look more similar to each other than others, because it's the parents and children of a single lineage. This law of independent assortment is what the famous monk Gregory Mendel, gave us in his experiments with pea plants, where through simple fertilization experiments, he was able to show that he could very accurately prove the probability of what the offspring of two different pea plants would look like. Usually, specifically, their blooms of, based off of the color, shape, size, and number of blooms on the two parents. What is the probability that their offspring will have purple flowers or white flowers, or have significantly smaller flowers than most? So again, he did do this through experimentation, but more importantly, through his work, he was able to produce mathematical equations that explained his ideas, and more specifically, were able to create probabilities, percentages of the likelihood of this or that occurring. And then through time, people studying his work, people replicating his work with peas and many other animals and plants at this point, that yes, this law seems to be pretty accurate, or rather that it is a tool that can help us accurately predict the lineage of how closely related different things are, and why, if things look similar, we have an explanation for that, especially if we can track their lineage. We know, well, they are related in this way. The theory to explain this law didn't come until we got an understanding of DNA and how genetics work. And so basically, it's taking that law one step further and saying, yes, we know that there seems to be a connection where offspring tend to look like their parent. And we can say that with confidence because we observe it all the time, and we have this nice law that mathematically spells it out for us. However, it doesn't explain why. Or the why we now understand is genes. It's the code of amino acids that's built into our DNA that we get different amounts of from both parents, and we understand the whole process of how that fusion occurs and how genetic data from both parents is combined and used in the production of a new organism. And so we have a working theory. Again, a theory because after the idea was initially posited, the work of many, many other scientists, not just in replicating to try and get the same results from the same experiments, to make the same observations, but also research built on this of saying, okay, there's this idea of chromosomal inheritance and genetics out there. If that idea is correct, then I could do this other experiment and expect this result to happen. And when that type of work is done, the expected results accurately happen, or occur accurately enough and with enough frequency that it seems that the idea is a reliable, accurate way to understand what is happening and why different organisms look and act more similar through their relation to each other, through their genetic relation to each other. And so we use this idea. It's a theory. It's a working theory, of course, but it's the best idea that we have at this point. And we're going to keep using it until somebody comes up with a better idea. That's when I say that, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a poor one. We can have very accurate ideas. It's coming back to that idea of humility of we're never going to definitively say we figured it out. We don't have to look at this anymore. We don't have to do any more research on this. Perhaps with time, as our confidence is built and as a larger and larger body of evidence builds up towards an idea, yes, we may spend less time researching that thing specifically, but inevitably we're always using theories as assumptions to work off of for new research. So we're always applying these theories, even when we're just using them as assumptions in further work that we do. All right. These last ones you hear most often for experiments relating to using humans, usually for medical research. Oh, I'm sorry. The first one, the variables, every experiment has variables, the independent and the dependent. We've all heard these before. The distinction is that the dependent variable is the one that we are very specifically trying to observe. The independent variable, that's anything else that we find does have a direct relation to the dependent variable. If we're observing some aspect of water, so an independent variable might be, say, the temperature, because we appreciate, well, depending on the temperature of the water, it's going to operate, it's going to function differently, it's going to act differently. And so maybe we appreciate, well, we take that into account and we want to see those differences, or maybe we don't want to see those differences. We only want to observe water in a very specific state. And so in that case, temperature is an independent variable, which we're hoping to control. It might be something that we're completely trying to control, such that, always staying a single temperature. Or maybe we want to see that variation, but we want to see it in a very controlled way. So we're not just going to do any random temperatures. We're going to select very specific temperatures and very specific increments of changing temperatures. And we're going to create parameters where we can guarantee, okay, the water in this vessel is exactly this temperature. Water in this other vessel is exactly this temperature, this other temperature. Run them through similar parameters, and then we can really notice the change, and more importantly, what is causing the change. Is the change a direct result of the temperature, or no, is the change occurring in both situations, which means there's some other variable in play that is causing the change. Controls, every experiment is going to have controls. And this is basically, we appreciate that in any situation, many times there are seemingly countless variables that can potentially affect the specific thing that you are trying to observe. And so whereas with the independent, maybe we are looking for very specific changes where we want to see it at this temperature and that temperature and this third one. In the case where, no, we don't want to see any differences in temperature, we don't want that to be a factor at all, then that would inevitably be part of the control, where, no, we're going to create parameters where the temperature never changes because we don't want it to affect the results. Okay, and blind study and double-blind study are the ones that most specifically you'll hear about in usually some type of medical research, whether it's giving a particular experimental drug to a group of people, or doing some kind of therapy, exposing people to different conditions to see their reactions. Of course, especially at this point, there are all kinds of ethical parameters established of what you can do to people and when and how many and why. But I digress. We've all heard of blind and double-blind studies. The important difference is that in one, the people doing the research are aware of the different parameters, and in another, they're not. There are all kinds of situations where there is a potential danger in the knowledge of the researchers creating bias in the data that they're collecting. And so in certain situations, a double-blind study is important so that we try and remove that potential bias, that potential human bias that could sully the data. I'm trying to think of an example. A basic example would be if they're testing for a drug and they're using a placebo, where some people are going to get the actual drug and some people are not going to get the actual drug. They're going to get a placebo that does nothing, but they're going to tell them this is the drug and they want to see their reaction. There are cases where the researchers want to know which is which, and that's relevant. But there's a lot of research, especially within the schools of thought of sociology, that shows that, again, there's all kinds of bias that can come into play. And maybe if the researchers knew which was the actual drug and which was the placebo, they would treat the patients in the experiment differently. They would use different language when they're offering the drug to them or something like that. And so maybe they just want to take that, as a control, they want to take that issue out of the experiment completely and just say, okay, nobody's going to know which is which. And only afterwards will that information be revealed, or will we find out what happened. Peer reviewed. This term comes up all the time, and it's a very basic idea. It's just an evaluation of the work, usually specifically by other scientists, more specifically by people in the relevant field. So, you know, we don't tend to have astronomers peer reviewing the work of microbiologists. You know, we want people that are going to be, we want the best people who are going to most effectively be able to evaluate, analyze, and critique the information, and again, usually very specific information. This I included. There is an international scientific vocabulary. You can find it online. It is extensive. It's a lot of jargon, and that is basically why I put this up, just to appreciate and recognize the idea that a lot of people in different situations are turned off by scientific talk or explanations because it uses a lot of jargon. It uses words that we are not familiar with. Lots of times it uses words that aren't even in our language. You know, there's a lot of Latin that's used to define different things in science. So it seems intimidating, or it seems confusing, it seems frustrating. Like, why do we need to bother with all of that nonsense? This is basically, again, usually more often than not, it comes from the fact that scientists are working on the frontier, and the majority of, you know, funky words that we have gotten out of science, or all of the Latin names, the nomenclature that we give to different organisms, it comes from scientists making discoveries and just saying, nobody's ever documented this before, so we don't have a word for it, or we don't have a name for it, so I'm just going to call it blank. And then through the peer review process, and then through the replication, as other scientists pick up that work and say, you know, I'm going to try and, you know, if this is true, then I should be able to do this other research, or I'm going to try and replicate this. And there's basically, through their work, there becomes consensus. You know, they're saying, the researcher before me called this thing blank, so that works for me, and I'll call it the same thing. And so a lot of terms, again, it's not that there's a single official body that definitively says, like, that is a scientific word, that is not a scientific word. They're usually built out of consensus, and so they're just used by everybody. So they're built out of convenience lots of times. Correlation and causation. Big ideas that are very commonly confused. But fortunately, it's not unnecessarily complex of an idea. Basically, correlation, when you see it applied within science, it is always a statistical measure. It's always going to be relating to numbers and percentages, showing how closely related variables seem to be. And sometimes they can seem very closely related. Like in my tame example here of, as ice cream sales increase, sunglass sales increase. And I wouldn't be surprised if we collected a massive amount of data, over many different countries over many years, and we could probably get some pretty conclusive results that anytime ice cream sales increase, sunglass sales increase. And so we would say there's a very strong correlation between those two variables. However, that in no way means that those things are directly related. That in no way means that there is a cause and effect relationship. That requires causation. And so in my example here, we would, upon further investigation and research, we would find that it's not that people want to buy more sunglasses when they consume ice cream. There's a totally separate variable that we hadn't accounted for in that correlation. In that case, it would have been the sun. So a more accurate causation referring to ice cream would be, as your ice cream consumption increases, so will your risk of heart disease. We have pretty definitively proven that one through the work of many people, replicating that data, studying human physiology more and more, And so we can say that with pretty good confidence that there is a cause and effect relationship between those two things, heart disease and ice cream consumption. So again, the biggest thing here is just to appreciate that correlation is not conclusive in any way, and it does not define a direct cause and effect relationship. More than anything, correlation, especially two things that are very strongly correlated, is a really good indicator of what we should be looking at next. If in whatever research you're doing, for whatever reason, a very strong statistical correlation is found, that is usually that's a sign of a really good research topic for somebody to go look into. Okay, there's a really strong correlation there. It could be a causation, it could be cause and effect, but we don't know that, so somebody go look into that. We can never use correlation as a definitive conclusion. All right, so sorry for the jargon, but that is the basics that we'll get into of just, that is the scientific method. It's a pretty straightforward process of knowledge acquisition where we try and learn more about the world around us by making ideas, making predictions, and then trying to test those ideas, and usually, again, specifically trying to prove those ideas wrong. And it's only when we are incapable of proving them wrong that we start to get more confidence that our idea is accurate or that we're on the right track. So there's a lot to be said for the practice and the concept of science. However, humans are fallible, and there's all kinds of ways that we can mess up or misconstrue the process. Or there's all kinds of ways that good science can get lost in the weeds of different realms, like the political realm or social media. And so that's what we're going to get into now. All the things that we need to be aware of, how science is getting consumed and processed by us. So first of all, let's get an appreciation for the research scientists. There are all kinds of different scientists out there, of which research scientist is a very specific one. In our day and age, and especially in the United States, the vast majority of research scientists are being hired through universities and other education systems. Usually because the university has a vested interest not only in furthering research and making a name for themselves, but usually in a lot of cases, being a researcher and getting a job as a researcher at a university also involves other tasks. Lots of times, young researchers, when they first come on board at a university, they're also required to teach X number of classes, which some people like. Some researchers love being professors and being an educator that is also able to do experimental research and be on the frontier of learning in that way. But there are plenty of people that come to the university system because they want the research opportunities. And that is it. And they're not going to be the best professors. But if they stick around long enough and get some good tenure, they very likely could move up to exclusively just doing research. A lot of scientists who are eager to do experimental research will go through the university system because it's one of the only places where enough money exists to fund experimental research. I keep saying experimental research to emphasize the idea that this is research on the frontier of our knowledge, which usually requires us to go to significant lengths to create experimental conditions, especially if you're somebody like a physicist working at the atomic level. We can't just manipulate atoms with our bare hands or even with tools, like superfine tweezers or whatever that we can construct. We need very technical, very expensive equipment to create things. I mean, for physics, the ultimate example would be something like the Hadron Collider, which has produced amazing research that has helped us push the frontier of our understanding in the atomic realm. However, it requires the work of many people and the investment of many, many dollars. Using the Hadron Collider as an example, one of the only other places that can usually provide the level of funding required for very serious experimental research is government institutions of one kind or another. It can come from private donors in different situations, but ultimately the idea is lots of times it requires a lot of investment, not just in money for the acquisition or development of equipment or new technologies, but also just paying the researcher. They need a basic salary. They need to be able to support themselves, and usually they need to be able to support at least several people helping them with their research. If they need to travel to specific locations, it's going to involve travel expenses, and where are they going to stay when they travel to wherever. So depending on the type of research, there can be a lot of different expenses that go into it. And usually those add up because good research takes time, or it takes time to do the research multiple times to replicate it, to see if you can get accurate results. So scientists who want to be research scientists have to go to some kind of institution that can consistently provide a lot of funding. In the case of universities, universities are one of the most common cases where this occurs. And through universities, we also get a look at the peer review process, because universities tend to work very closely with scientific journals. Scientific journals are usually independent organizations that just act as publishers. They are collecting research that has been done, research papers that have been written, usually coming out of education institutions, universities, and colleges, and they are vetting that information. They are the primary source of the peer review process, and either through people directly working with the journal or through a network with other universities that they will take that research article from whoever, and they will source it out to other scientists in the same field, or experts in the field of topic that the research is on. And it's usually a process of several months. There's a lot of variability depending on the discipline, like a biologist versus a chemist versus a sociologist, putting their work out to a journal for peer review. But the average that I tend to find out there is it's at least 5 to 6 months. And that's best case scenario. For some people, the peer review process takes years. But at its fastest, it takes months for your work to be sent out to a bunch of other experts, for them to study it, for them to critique it. They're not, in this stage, they don't have the time to actually replicate your experiment. They're more just reading everything in your paper and making sure, there weren't any obvious flaws in your method, and if you did any computations to come up with your results, we ran the numbers and that all seems to be accurate. And if you can get enough consensus from your peers that yes, this research is sound or accurate enough, then the journal will approve it for publication. And then it will just have to fit into their calendar of, well, we have an opening in the June publication, so we'll wait until June to publish it, or whenever. Sometimes maybe they have an opening immediately and your paper gets published very quickly. So already we have a lot of different partners. We have the scientists themselves, we have the university, we have the journals, we have a lot of different partners which potentially can have different goals in mind, or different interests. We of course always hope that everybody is unbiased and is willing to publish any and all research, because it's all knowledge that can potentially help edify us as a whole. However, there become lots of what I'll call human or social factors, such as university wanting to make a better name for itself by publishing a lot of really innovative or really impressive work. The journals, while their ultimate goal is to publish scientific work, they are a printed publication, and like any other, they need to sell copies. And so if they deem in whatever way that maybe your research isn't impressive enough, or it's too boring, or it doesn't really fit the theme of research that we were trying to do in this issue, then they may choose not to even review it in the first place, or they may review it and then just decide, like, you know what, it's good research, but we're not going to use it because it doesn't fit the issue, or it doesn't fit the narrative that we're trying to tell. So there can be real hindrances to the information getting out there. Yeah. And of course, there can be market pressures outside of the system of researchers, universities, and journals, especially when it comes to products being sold. I said, if you're a researcher, you're inevitably working for somebody that has a lot of money, somebody that can bankroll your work. Well, there are plenty of private businesses and institutions that have that money as well, such as companies in the pharmaceutical industry. And so while there is a lot of research on pharmaceuticals that's done through the university system, there's also plenty that's done in-house by pharmaceutical companies. And so this is not to say that the research that they do is automatically or inherently biased and not accurate, but it is important that we recognize, well, show me the money. Where is it coming from? Who's funding this? What potential interests or influence would they have on this research? And so if we see, if we read some research that is relating to side effects for a new drug that's coming out, and the results seem very positive, that the side effects are minimal, and then we see that the same company that produces that new medication funded and provided the facility to do this research, we can appreciate there's potential bias there, and maybe we look further into that research before we come to a conclusion on our own of if that's a potentially good or bad thing to have. Fraud is always a concern. Fortunately, the peer review process overall seems to do a pretty good job of catching fraudulent science. These three definitions of fraud that I have here are from three different organizations, both nationally and internationally. So there's no hard and fast definition of scientific fraud, but it's usually the idea that somebody is fabricating their research in some way. They're saying they did something when they didn't, or they're fudging the numbers that they got in their results. Those are the two most common ways that it occurs. However, as the first definition mentioned, sometimes it can just be recognized as, well, rather than fraud, more just misconduct, which would just be like, we've studied your research and we found that basically you didn't try hard enough. Like, there are all these flaws that you should have accounted for, but you didn't. It's a situation where they're not saying it's fraudulent. They're not saying that the person is intentionally lying about the results. They're just saying you did a poor job. You didn't do good science. And so it either needs to be replicated or it's not worth addressing this issue. It does, so again, it's not super often, or rather when it does occur, it tends to get rooted out pretty quickly, and it tends to get publicized so that people are aware of it. Usually, if it doesn't get caught in the peer review process, it hopefully gets caught pretty quickly after the research gets published and put out into the world. Other scientists can examine it and begin to try and test it themselves, to either work off of those results to do a different experiment, or to say, I'm going to replicate, I'm going to do this exact same experiment. And maybe they find I got completely different results. And so that is a cue then of somebody else's step and be like, okay, so same experiment done twice, two different results, let's do it again. And after multiple replication studies, they're called, if we find that, yeah, none of the results that anyone else is getting matches the original person's results, then we begin to question, well, what happened here? What happened with this original research? is it misconduct just because you didn't do a good job, you were negligent in some way, or is this an example of fraud where it seems like you were very intentionally trying to paint a picture that was inaccurate? So for anyone that hasn't heard of p-hacking, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot in different circles, especially in the world of statistics, but it's basically the idea that you can take a data set, you can take a set of a bunch of different recorded observations, and through mathematics and other means, by reorganizing them or by displaying the information in a different way, you can display different results, or you can make it appear as if it's coming to very different conclusions. And so this is a cool project that was put on by a group several years ago, in which now there are many different topics that they could use as an example for this, but their one for this is you're a social scientist and you think that the U.S. economy is affected by whether Republicans or Democrats are in office. And so basically, they've set it up so it's very user-friendly. We'll give you this link for anybody that wants to play around with this more and read into this topic more. But basically, they're saying, here, you have terms. You have a big data set. You have all these different levels of politicians of when they were in office, which party they were in. You have all of these different economic measures, unemployment, inflation, GDP. And by picking and choosing which groups of data, which data sets that we include in the terms that we're displaying, we'll see that the effect changes here. So if I do this, so I did that really quick, but then they're doing the math for us. So fortunately, we don't have to get into it, but I can show how by messing around with the terms here, by picking which sets of data that I'm using in this case, both representatives and senators, employment, inflation, and stock prices, I can show a very strong correlation that when Republicans are in office, the economy seems to be doing better. The p-value here is a common statistical term that is used to refer to what is the likelihood that if your idea was wrong, you would get the exact same result. And as long as that percentage value is very, very low, 0.05 or lower, then the idea is that the chance of you being wrong and getting the same results is so unlikely that you are probably accurate or you are probably correct. And so here, by picking and choosing the data that we use, we're able to create a publishable result, a result with a p-value of 0.05. So it's very likely, based off this data, that Republicans have a positive overall effect on the economy when they're in office. And so, of course, if we use the same data set for Democrats, we're going to get publishable results that Democrats have a negative effect. However, what if we mess around with the data set a little? What if I do that? Oh, so all I did was add GDP and take out inflation, and it appears as if I can now say the complete opposite as before. It turns out that it looks like Democrats have a more positive effect than Republicans.
Hey, Taylor, are you showing us something with those calculations?
Oh, no.
Sorry, we
Has it not been up?
Hurt.
Sorry about that.
My fault. I didn't see that.
Can you see this now? It's a web browser screen.
There we go.
Okay. Well, sorry, that was I was talking a lot of nonsense then if you weren't looking at this. So again, this is a group that created this data set just to show us this potentially dangerous situation known as p-hacking, where we can take a data set and manipulate how we present it to come up with different results using the same information, the same data. And so we're trying to figure out, Democrats or Republicans, who is in office more often when the economy is doing good, or which, when in office, which political party is better for the economy. So we have all these different parameters between what type of politician, the president versus senators, etc. We have different economic measures, employment, inflation, GDP. And so right now, using only these specific data sets, looking at senators and representatives over the years, and comparing that to employment, GDP, and stock prices, we can create results that show Democrats have a more positive effect. However, all I have to do is move the numbers around. In this case, I just took out the GDP statistics, and suddenly it looks like we have a really, really strong correlation between Republicans being in office and the economy doing very well. And the important thing here is the data itself was not manipulated. It's not like a 3 was changed to a 4 somewhere. We are just presenting the same data in a different perspective. Or in this case, we have a very large set of data, all of these parameters over here, and we are cherry picking which bits of data we are going to use in our results. And when we do that, we can make it seem like there are very different results. This is an example of fraud that is, I won't say it's common. The term is common, and it's something that a lot of effort is put into when new work's put out there, especially work that is very heavy with data, and specifically statistical data. Of, okay, a lot of people need to check this, proofread it, and figure out what is this data set? Is the data set being used accurate in the first place? And then how is that data being presented to create a conclusion? And whether or not it's being done accurately or not. So here's a quick example. If anyone has anyone heard of this paper before? This is the title of a research paper that came out in the late 90s. It seems very legitimate and serious. It's very, very specific. Clearly, it's using a lot of science jargon. This is in fact the most common research paper that is referenced by people in opposition to public vaccinations, the anti-vaccine community. And I am not making any statements about anti-vaccine pros and cons. What is most important in our discussion of scientific literacy here is to examine this piece of research specifically. And it gets referenced a lot, so is it a reliable source of information? Was the research done accurately? What happened when it got peer reviewed? What did other scientists have to say about it? And how has the information been used since then? This is the research paper that, more specifically, is referenced to show that the MMR vaccination has a connection to or causes autism. However, although the paper did try to draw this conclusion after it came out, it was published in 1998, and within several years after it came out, many scientists had looked at it, questioned it, replicated the exact same experiment, the exact same study, and found very different results. Basically, 3 or 4 separate scientists around the world tried to replicate the study and could not come to the same conclusion. And so a lot of work looked into analyzing this paper, and it was pretty quickly refuted. And there were all kinds of issues where the researchers were called out on inaccuracies, the cherry picking of data, just not doing a good job of being very serious about controlling different variables. And it was basically concluded that this piece of research is not viable. not viable in that we shouldn't use it as a basis of knowledge to work off of to do more research. And so this research is still out there. A good thing about a lot of scientific journals that publish research is if it gets refuted, they won't just erase it. They won't just wipe it away as if it never happened. They will still have it in their records, but they will always give some kind of notification of, void, or this has been disproven, or this has been pulled from the issue because of this contention within the community. And so you can still find this paper out there, but it always comes with with some fine print of other research has shown that this is unreliable. So this is just an example of misconduct that has occurred in the past, but it's a poignant example because a lot of people still recognize it and reference it to make different assertions or to justify different points. And again, I won't speak on the efficacy of vaccines, but you cannot use this specific research paper as a justification for opposition to vaccines, because not only did it not accurately prove that, but it has since been refuted by a number and an increasingly growing number of other research papers. Let's go to the media now. So this is a fun visual I found of this is science getting shoved through the news cycle. And we start at the top. We have a researcher who has done very good work, been very critical of themselves, and has come to a conclusion, but we'll notice that that conclusion is in no way definitive. They're saying A is correlated with B at this percentage, given C, assuming D, and under E condition. So they've done some very thorough research about a very specific topic. There's a very good likelihood that their work is very esoteric in some way, such that you can't fully understand their research unless you already have a body of knowledge on the topic that they're researching. And so first, moving clockwise around the circle, it gets put out by the university. And again, the university doesn't just want to put out research. They want to put out good research that is impressive, that is innovative, that will reflect well upon the university as an organization. So they might bring out a lot of fanfare for this research, even if it seems very esoteric or very specific. They'll really tout it as the latest and greatest discovery that has been made. And immediately we can see as we move around the circle, as it goes through different kinds of news organizations, especially in our digital age, not just through the nightly news cycle, but through all different kinds of internet sources, or news or media that is using information from the news in different ways. And basically, we can see how the message, the conclusion, the original conclusion of the researcher gets distorted through time. In the media, this is usually in one way or another coming from the desire to make a story. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's the case that people are trying to spread disinformation, which is the spreading of incorrect information intentionally, for one reason or another, if they have a product to sell or something like that. But just as often, if not more perhaps, we find examples of misinformation, which is where simply whoever, whatever reporter or editor, whoever in whatever news outlet got hold of this research or was told about this research secondhand and simply did not understand it, or did not understand it as accurately as they could have or should have. And so, it's a game of telephone, where by the time it gets to two individuals talking about it, if both of them have not read the original research, they're not likely to have the full picture. They're not likely to have the the most accurate understanding of the research and what the research is trying to conclude or hypothesize. Yeah. And the biggest issue here is it's important to recognize that although journalists have their own system of critiquing themselves, verifying information, it's not the same as the scientific community has. There is, outside of your own publication, there is no peer review process where, as a journalist, you put your article out to all the other news outlets and magazines, and they all critique it before you are allowed to present it on the nightly news. The information, there's just not the same guarantee within the media as within the scientific community that information will get properly vetted. So we need to be aware of that. And again, this is not to say that that is always the case. This is not to say that you should never trust anything on the nightly news. We need to recognize, again, that as humans we're flawed, and throughout this process of making discoveries through the scientific method and communicating those discoveries, there are all kinds of things that we can trip up on the way to unfortunately spread information less accurately and less effectively use that information. So here's a fun example. It's a pretty benign one, but it's a good one. So here's a research paper that came out several years ago. And we can see immediately from the title, it's very specific. High flavanol chocolate to improve placenta function and to decrease the risk of preeclampsia, a double-blind randomized clinical trial. And so we get an idea of it, but maybe we're like, what does that mean? That's a lot of jargon. We can go to the objective. Usually at the very beginning of a research paper, there will be some kind of overview or objective or synopsis that is hopefully usually in 1 or 2 paragraphs, just giving you an overview of this is the question that we had, this is the research that we set up, this is the experiment that we set up, and this is the conclusion that we came to. So from this objective, they're saying previous studies showed conflicting results regarding the role of chocolate consumption during pregnancy and the risk of preeclampsia. So right off the bat, they're saying other people have researched this topic, but the results have been inconclusive. So it is the case that, maybe, well, at some point, somebody initially was curious about this topic. Is there some kind of connection, correlation, or causation between chocolate consumption during pregnancy and the risk of preeclampsia? Now, for pregnant women, they did some research. They came to whatever conclusion. Maybe they found that our results show that it seems that there is a pretty direct relationship between the two. And that research was published. Other scientists read it, critiqued it, and decided it needed to be replicated. It needed to be tested. They tested it. They did not get the same results. Maybe they found that no, it does not. We did the same experiment, or we did a very similar experiment, and it seems that the opposite is true. So this group of researchers is just pointing out other people have been down this road before. They've studied this topic, but the results from those studies are varied enough that it is inconclusive whether there's a connection between chocolate and the risk of this condition during pregnancy. So instead of just replicating the exact same study, they're trying to do it a little more specifically. We aim to evaluate the impact of high flavanol chocolate in a randomized clinical trial. So they're saying, plenty of people have looked at the effect of chocolate on pregnant women. Some people say it helps, some people say it doesn't, some people say it's harmful. We are going to look at a very specific part of the chocolate and try and see if that is the determining factor. And so the variable that they are testing for is the high flavanol, which in general for us, the higher flavanol the chocolate is, the darker the chocolate is. So this basically amounted to, in a very specific, well-measured way, they had so many pregnant women, they fed them milk chocolate, they fed them dark chocolate, and they assessed them for risk of preeclampsia. Now, in the conclusion, we find the most definitive thing in the conclusion is that the high flavanol chocolate did not improve placental function, which, without getting into it, directly relates to the risk of preeclampsia. So basically, they were saying from our experiment, it seems like there is no direct effect, or high flavanol in the chocolate does not have a direct effect on the supposed or seeming connection between chocolate consumption and risk of preeclampsia. So they're saying, other people have shown that there might be a connection. We're not sure about that, but we have been able to confirm that the amount of flavanol in the chocolate does not affect this relationship. So again, pretty specific, but pretty conclusive. And there has been other work since that has validated this idea, this specific idea that flavanol in chocolate does not have a significant effect on altering the risk of preeclampsia in pregnant women. So, thorough, good research, but pretty specific, pretty esoteric in that, if you're not in this situation, if you're not a pregnant woman that wants to eat some chocolate, this is not necessarily going to directly affect you, and you're not necessarily going to be concerned with this research. You may even find it boring, but you don't want the research to be boring, especially if we're trying to sell something. So here we have Science Daily. Science Daily is overall a good website. It's basically a science news outlet. They are keeping track of the journals and the universities. They are tracking when new research comes out, and they are taking it a step further to advertise to the general public of hey, here's a study that was just put out. And they'll give you all the information on it. They'll give you the source and what journal published it and when, what university the work came from, or specifically the researchers that made the work. Depending on the journal, because some journals are free, some journals you have to pay a subscription fee for, like other magazines. So depending on the journal, Science Daily may give you a direct link to that actual piece of research. But regardless, we see that for some reason, they didn't go with the title of the research itself, probably because it uses a lot of jargon and is long and boring. In fact, in this full story explanation goes on, but we find that only here, once we get into the explanation of what is this about, do we see that they mention the title, high flavanol chocolate to improve placental function, etc. That was too boring. That was too convoluted. They didn't want to go with that. That's not going to pop when you're scrolling through on their page. You're not going to stop and read that article. So instead, let's jazz it up and say the benefits of chocolate during pregnancy. That catches your eye faster. However, since we've already looked at the actual research, its objective and conclusion, we can see that this title, the benefits of chocolate during pregnancy, is kind of misleading. Because if, first of all, the researchers are stating that the benefit of chocolate during pregnancy is inconclusive. We don't know if there is a real benefit or not. And on top of that, they point out that, as we see right at the beginning of the objective, previous studies show. So these researchers are saying, that is not the conclusion we have come to. That conclusion is based off of the work of other scientists with other research papers. We are not, the only definitive conclusion they come to is that high flavanol chocolate does not have an effect on women consuming chocolate during pregnancy. So already we can read this title and this isn't really accurate to what the research is saying. It's definitely better clickbait. We're more likely to click on it and read about it. It seems more enticing. But once we actually read the article, we may find, that I was hoping for something more exciting. I was hoping for something that told me I can eat chocolate. And from here, from this middleman source of Science Daily communicating this new research to the world, I don't know if this news outlet actually found this article through Science Daily. However, it wound up on the nightly news. Now, I've never tried to share YouTube like this, so tell me if this works or not, if you can hear this.
Not always. I think to rein it in. And as you're debating whether or not you're going to take that Tylenol, you can reach for a little more chocolate. That's right. So this is the good news. Turns out if you're pregnant, eating 30 grams a day of chocolate, that's about 2/3 of a chocolate bar, not the whole chocolate bar, could improve blood flow to the placenta and benefit the growth and development of your baby, especially in women at risk for preeclampsia or high blood pressure in pregnancy. And it doesn't really seem to matter whether it's milk chocolate, my preference, or dark chocolate, which contains more antioxidants. Doesn't appear to be because of the antioxidants. So, milk or dark, either way, indulge. All right, 2/3 of it. Okay, good to know. Thank you, doctor.
Okay, so this is, the topic, of course, this isn't as serious as something like climate change that we can debate. So it seems pretty benign, and it's not that big of an issue in that it seems like the news report was not inaccurate in general. They did specify that the consumption of chocolate could have a positive effect for pregnant women at risk of preeclampsia. They don't go ahead and definitively say this will help, and they even mention the idea that it seems like it doesn't matter whether it's dark or milk chocolate, which is what this research that they're referencing was actually referring to. And you can, fortunately, if you contact news organizations, if they don't directly source their research, you can get that information from them. And so I do know in this case, this little news clip was based off of this specific research article that we just looked at. But so it is an example. So what happened here? Because we can see that from the original piece of research to the little clip on the news, we had that game of telephone. It was not the same information on one end as it was on the other. And basically, again, the research was kind of narrow. It wasn't the easiest thing for the layman to read immediately and understand. In an effort to publicize it, the study was taken a little bit out of context, and the news media. I'm saying the news media did not properly understand the research. We really can't say if they didn't understand it or they intentionally decided like this will make a better clip if we put the positive spin on it of saying like it shows that it could help, so maybe it's worth consuming that chocolate. And the other thing that gives me pause in this is you may have noticed during that clip where they're talking about the potential benefits of chocolate that they had several swooping shots of different brands of chocolates moving across the screen, suddenly making us all think about chocolate and how much we want to eat it right now. So again, overall a benign example of the distortion that can happen, but a good example, and helping us to appreciate if the slightest little tweaking can be done with something as simple as the potential effects of chocolate, how can other information get distorted through this process of communication? So what can we do about this? Let's go over some tips and tricks, and we're specifically talking about using the internet. How can we use the internet to vet the information that we hear, whether it's from a friend, whether it's from the nightly news like that? How can we go find that research article that they were talking about? These first bullet points, I say they're for the World Wide Web, but they're more specifically for Google. Just the vast majority of us use Google, so especially those last three bulletins, to use quotes around exact phrases and asterisks. Those are very specific tools that are programmed into the Google search engine that not everybody knows about, that can really make a difference when you're researching something. Like the minus sign, for example. If you're interested in large cats like jaguars, and you want to do some research on what is the top speed that a jaguar can get to, if you just Google that, at least the first half dozen links that you find are probably going to be about the car, and how well it performs in different conditions and its top speed. So if you're searching for Jaguars and you put -car, that is telling the search engine, find everything relating to Jaguars that does not have to do with the car specifically. So that can be a really effective tool to shave off some of the potential information that can get pushed to you through a search engine like that. And in terms of asking better questions, I know that's very vague and broad. I could have worded that better, because it's not as if I'm just scolding of like, because your questions are bad, ask better questions. That's more referring to the idea of like the next point, using the proper terminology when we're searching for something. Usually this comes out of doing research on a topic. The more that, especially if we're trying to learn about a topic, or especially if we have a very specific piece of research that we don't fully understand and we need to go back and learn some background knowledge, some general information on this topic, that can help us appreciate not just the terminology, but the ideas that are really being applied in this situation. And we can hone our questions to get to the answer that we want faster. What would be an example? Oh, okay. So the process by which scientists have measured and estimated the age of the Earth is based off of radiometric dating, which some people may be familiar with. It's basically the idea that over long periods of time, the physical structure of atoms changes, and we can note that change and we can record it, and we can make estimations and observations about the rate at which that change occurs, so that we can look at something that's very old, whether it's a human artifact or a fossil or just a very old rock, and by examining at the atomic level what that thing is comprised of, and more importantly, the state that those atoms are in, we can make estimations about how old it is. Because we can say, okay, well, 50% of its carbon atoms have changed and degraded in this way. And based off of our estimations and previous models that we made, we know that once it takes X number of years for 50% of the carbon in a structure to reach this point. And so we can make estimations based off of previous knowledge that this is probably around the same age. And carbon dating is probably the most common use of this technique that is radiometric dating. People talk about carbon dating things all the time. Again, it's just looking at things that are very old that have carbon, how much of that carbon has changed or degraded over time, and based off of that estimating, well, it probably took this long for the carbon to change, so this object has been around for this long. There's a lot out there about how carbon dating is not an accurate way to show or to predict the age of the Earth. And there's a lot of people that try and refute the general consensus on the age of the Earth, which is about 4.5 million years, based off of the idea that they're using, you can't use carbon metric dating because it's inaccurate. And this is actually correct, because carbon only lasts so long. It only degrades to a certain point before it breaks down to the point where we can't measure it anymore, or before it's not changing anymore. So carbon is not the only atom that is observed. Radiometric dating overall refers to just looking at any atom and how it changes over time. So there is a lot out there about carbon dating and it being related to the age of the Earth. However, they're not actually related, because to find the age of the Earth, we need atoms that break down much slower than carbon does, so that there's a longer time scale involved. And so carbon dating is not used at all in the observation of the Earth's age. However, if you hear about that and you go Googling about carbon dating and the age of the Earth, you're going to find a lot of misinformation out there, simply because other people are misinformed, and they're going to be talking about how those two things are related when they're really not related at all. So learning about radiometric dating in the first place and understanding that it's not just carbon atoms that we're looking at, it's many other atoms, and we have to use different atoms to observe different things. We get an appreciation of how using different words when we're searching for information can provide different and hopefully more accurate results when we're using the right information. Reading beyond the title. So here is an example. So okay. So climate change is a big topic right now. Everybody can agree with that. And let's say there's a lot of sources out there. There's a lot of debate. You're not sure who you can go to for accurate information. So you start searching around the internet, looking for who is a valid or a safe source of information that I can trust. And let's say you find the International Climate Science Coalition. That sounds very legitimate. That sounds like people that are very concerned about this topic and probably are putting a lot of effort into researching it and knowing what they're talking about. Seems legitimate. However, as we look into it, even right here on the front page of their website, they have a lot of articles and videos and such. So right here at the top, we already see something that for me is a red flag. We see this term, climate realist. Climate realism. The words in and of themselves are not inherently bad. However, climate realist, in my experience, tends to be a term that people use who are in the climate denial group. Basically, people who think that climate change is not real, or climate change is not as serious of an issue as people think that it is. And so they think that all the people that are concerned about climate change are over-exaggerating, and they are the realists. And so that's where that term comes from. So I immediately see that, and I think, ooh, what is the real intention of this organization? What are they trying? What kind of information are they trying to spread? And referencing at the bottom of their website here, I found that one of their financial sponsors is the Heartland Institute. And I didn't know who the Heartland Institute was. So I went and looked them up. They are a political think tank group working out of Washington. And among other projects, they have published this article, or this document, a large PDF, Climate Change Reconsidered, Fossil Fuels Under Policymakers. What is this thing? Well, they tell us right here in this intro. In this volume, a number of scientists and economists and other experts refute the International Panel on Climate Change's claim that the impacts of climate change on human well-being and the natural environment justify dramatic reduction in the use of fossil fuels. So they're arguing for the idea that just because there's climate change doesn't mean we have to decrease our fossil fuels. Which, again, without getting into a further debate of the research and the argument that that would be an effective way to reduce climate change, without getting any deeper, I can, and in many situations I should dig that much deeper. But right off the bat, I get another red flag of, okay, this organization seems inherently biased towards their use of fossil fuels. And in fact, we go on to look at the authors of this article, and many people involved with this organization are well-known climate deniers or people working within the fossil fuel for fossil fuel companies. So again, I'm not offhand saying like, oh, automatically I know this is BS and I should ignore it. I'm not saying that. You need to decide for yourself at what point you have vetted information enough that you can confidently come to a conclusion on it. However, that is automatically, for me, seeing that type of language is a red flag to recognize maybe there is some inherent bias involved here, and I should probably dig a little deeper. If that is not enough for me to decide this is good information or this is not a good source of information, it is at the very least a sign that I need to dig deeper. I need to find out more. to that point of standards, use tested and true standards. And what I mean by that is it's important that you take the time to define standards for yourself. There's a seemingly limitless, there's a seemingly limitless amount of sources of information out there. And we live in an age of information where you can find people on either extreme of any topic, making seemingly very definitive statements that are totally in opposition to each other. So how do you go about finding the right information? Well, ultimately, that is a process for you as an individual to come to terms with. It has to do with your beliefs and the level at which you are willing and interested in vetting information, and deciding through your work of vetting information sources that are reliable and accurate. And the only way you're going to figure that out is by testing those sources, both by going to them again and again for different topics or different information and seeing if that material is reliable. And you see if that material is reliable by referencing it or trying to back it up with other sources, so that even once you have done the work to, again, whether it's a news site or a particular scientific journal or a website, once you have taken the time to study information coming out of that organization and decide, yes, they are a reliable source. That doesn't mean wash your hands, job well done. I can always 100% rely on this source. I can always go to them for all of my needs. No, you need to maintain your skepticism and your curiosity. You always need to be able to back up information. You need to find other sources that are saying the same thing that are going to be able to validate it in one way or another. And you should certainly always have multiple sources. Even as you find sources of information that you find reliable and you are confident to go back to them again and again, don't just use one. Have multiple ones, because even if people are being reliable and accurate in presenting the same information, they may still present it differently, and you may get a slightly different story depending on who's telling the story. So it's important that you take the time to decide what sources are good, how do I know that they're good, and how will I continue to vet them and keep an eye on them. I make the point here of trust journals and government sources basically just because they already tend to have a system in place to vet their own information and be very self-critical about what they're putting out there. And usually we know this because they are very transparent with this information. Usually, whether it's online or through talking to an individual in the organization, somebody can explain to you, yes, here's the process. For a journal, they'll usually put out information of, yes, we do peer review, and here's how we do it. Sometimes even for a specific piece of research, they will let you know, like, here is who we sent this to, here is who looked at this, and it got validated, and this is how long it took our peer review process to go through. So yeah, if certainly over a .com, any kind of government site or education site or nonprofit site, in general, we can assume that these sites are more reliable because inherently they are not designed to be selling you something, which a .com usually is. However, as I've been describing, that doesn't mean you outright trust every single thing on a .gov or a .edu website. It's just a good starting point. Yeah, and Wikipedia references. So this seems like a joke because we all know that everything on Wikipedia is suspect. Anybody can become an editor and put whatever they want on Wikipedia, right? So why would this ever be a reliable source? Well, in and of itself, it's not. You should certainly never leave it at Wikipedia. You don't want to be explaining something to someone, and when they ask, where did you learn about that? You say Wikipedia, and they'll immediately recognize, oh, well, not the most reliable source. Maybe you didn't look into that. However, we can still use Wikipedia because Wikipedia, by and large, does a very good job of referencing its own articles. So here we have a very generic science page on Wikipedia about the gene, you know, and there's a lot of info on here because at this point we've done a lot of research, there's a lot of information, but most importantly, at the bottom, we see that all of this information is referenced. We're getting there. There we go. Look at all these citations. Now, the majority of these are actual research articles. So while I may not be able to while I may or I shouldn't rely directly on, you know, the sentence as it is written out in Wikipedia, it does a very good source of referencing itself, hyperlinking down to the citation. And then, you know, let's say that it referenced to this article. There is usually a link that you can go to, and oh look, here is an article, or here is a journal. It's not a journal in our country, but fortunately they are good enough to give us a translation. So we can get information on the original research article that the information that Wikipedia is referencing is based off of. So yes, stereotypically, Wikipedia in and of itself, not a reliable source for vetting and referencing information. However, if we take the extra step, if we're reading a Wikipedia page, to go down and use these references and citations as a jumping off point to do more research on the internet, Wikipedia can suddenly become a gold mine of reliable resources. Certainly more reliable than Wikipedia potentially. So yeah, don't hesitate to use Wikipedia. Just don't stop your research at Wikipedia. All right, I got 3 points to talk about for research articles in general, because again, nobody's perfect, including the human researchers who are writing these articles. And there's all kinds of things that we can appreciate that can happen. There are overgeneralizations or extrapolations. This is a hypothetical. However, this is a very common issue throughout the history of medical research. The idea that for many, many generations, white men, usually of a very specific age, like, you know, 25 to 50, were considered the generalized, stereotypical, or ideal human. So they were the standard. So if we're doing research on the human body, then we don't need to test anybody other than white men of that age group, and we'll get a really good data set that we can apply to all humans. Well, that's a huge overgeneralization. We know that now, and there's a lot of implicit bias, racism and sexism and all kinds of things involved in that issue. Unfortunately, we don't see that as much anymore in research. However, we need to appreciate that there are all kinds of biases that researchers can potentially bring to their work. You know, assumptions that they're making, that they're not even thinking about it as an assumption, because from their perspective, that's just the way the world is. And it takes somebody else to call them out on this. Sometimes it may not get noticed, and it takes you sitting there reading this article that's already been published. You recognize, ooh, that really seems like a bias that might affect the results here, and you know that might taint how you read that information and how you choose to use it. Conflicts of interest, of course, we've already kind of talked about. The most common example again, in the world of medical research is studying different treatments or different drugs and how effective they are. And again, if we find that these studies are being funded and published by the company that is responsible for producing those treatments or drugs, then we recognize there is, you know, red flag again. It's not that doesn't definitively mean the research is no good, but we should immediately perk our ears up when we see that and recognize, okay, there might be a very clear conflict of interest here, and so as I am reading this, I need to be looking out for that. This last idea, absolute versus relative percentages, this kind of relates back to the idea of p-hacking, where I can have a data set, and depending on how I use math to move the numbers around, I can make it appear as if the data is saying very different things. In this example of percentages, where, you know, if we have a medical problem causes 2 people in a million to have a stroke, and then we get a treatment, it reduces it to 1 person in a million. We can say, wow, 50% reduction, fantastic, amazing, what a great treatment. But we can appreciate that the absolute change is very, very insignificant. It's not helping that many more people in the population. And of course, this is a hypothetical, this is just one example, but we can get an appreciation of, depending on how we present data, we can potentially tell very different stories about what that data is saying and the conclusions that we're trying to draw. So we need to be aware of this as a reader. We need to be aware of these potential biases or overgeneralizations or assumptions that the researchers themselves or whoever is funding the research could be tainting it with. So here's a good checklist for us to look at. Anytime I am reading a research paper, which is usually where my path, whenever I go down the rabbit hole of the internet to try and vet information, more often than not, I end up on some kind of journal, reading some kind of scientific article. So when we're looking at these scientific articles, first of all, is it a good hypothesis? If we can run it through our basic if-then kind of statement and appreciate, like, is that a reasonable assumption to make, or is that a reasonable hypothesis? Is that a hypothesis that can even accurately be tested in the first place? And more importantly, is it something that can be tested multiple times? Okay, I'll get to that. So who funded the research? We've already talked about. And again, if a certain person funded it, that doesn't automatically mean, it's no good and you shouldn't trust it. It's just, we need to appreciate that as a factor in the research and in the story that people are trying to tell with the research. So we need to be aware of who is funding this research, who is putting it out there. This is a big thing we didn't get into yet. Experimental research is, as I discussed before, it's brand new. It's on the forefront of our understanding. It's saying we don't know this about the world, and I'm going to make a hypothesis, and I'm going to go and try and test it and prove it wrong. I'm going to try and discover new things. That's experimental research. Observational science is just as valuable in a lot of different situations, but it's a very different animal. The most common example of observational science I can think of is in the natural sciences. So if somebody is doing population studies of the eastern bluebird in a certain county, in a certain state, they're not necessarily experimenting. They're not necessarily trying to capture bluebirds and run them through an experiment to see how they react to different stimulus. They're just observing. They're just going out and they're picking specific parameters, like how many bluebirds are there total, how many males and how many females are there, how many eggs are they laying every year, and they're just collecting a large data set. So there can be a lot of research papers out there that are not really that are not creating a strong hypothesis and trying to come to a conclusion. They're just saying, we went out and we did the legwork and we made all these observations, and here's this data that we can show you. They may come to conclusions about, like, once we collected the data and analyzed it, it seems like we can make these statements about bluebirds and how many and where they are and how many and how they tend to mate. But there doesn't necessarily have to be a specific hypothesis for these observational studies. The last is literature review. Literature reviews are great. They can be a really good source, especially for us, the layperson, to navigate a lot of complex science. But this is basically a single or a group of scientists getting together and analyzing research papers in a specific field. And so they are analyzing all of that, bringing the different conclusions together and summarizing them for us. And so this, you could read a literature review. It'll be written just as any other experimental research paper, with an intro or an objective and then an explanation of the methods and the process. But this will be more like, we're a group of researchers, we're a group of sociologists, studying the effects of whatever. And there have been many, many studies on this topic throughout the years. And so we looked at 50 different studies on this topic, and we've condensed the knowledge down, and we've abbreviated it. And if there are any specific trends where all of the studies seem to be finding the same thing, we note that here. And so these can be a great way, again, for us as people not in the field, not in the specific field of research, to much more quickly assimilate a lot of information on research in that field. However, a literature review isn't, again, it's not experimental. So they're not necessarily going to give you any specific conclusions. They're just giving you information in a more concise, readable form. They may come to conclusions. They may say it seems that 70% of the research papers we looked at came to the same conclusion, and so we assume that there's validity to this idea. Or they may not, or they may just give you a general, like, here's what's out there. So at first, all of these different kinds of articles can look very similar in the way they're written and laid out. But it's important to recognize, and usually within that first intro paragraph, based off of if we see a very clear hypothesis and conclusion or not, we can get an idea of, was this experimental? Was this a review? Was this just observational data collection that's going on? What exactly is this paper about? Is the hypothesis applicable? Of course. This kind of seems general, but basically you want to appreciate that sometimes somebody can reference research, which is very good research. It's done very well. The results that it has, the conclusions that it comes to can be very accurate. However, it may not be very applicable to the specific situation that it's getting referenced for. A good example would be the research on high flavonol chocolate that we saw before. Overall, it seems like a very solid piece of research, but it's on a very, very specific issue, one which didn't really get addressed properly by the time we got to the news presentation about it. It's not that the research was bad, but maybe if we're talking about whether or not pregnant women should consume chocolate, it may not be the most applicable piece of research to directly reference to make a point. Did the research use a good sample? And this is basically just if they use people or if they use individuals of whatever kind to test a parameter, how many individuals did they use? If a research paper has a very small sample size, then the likelihood that their results are accurate for the majority of people is not very likely. An example of this would be the article that I said is usually referenced by anti-vaxxers, where one problem that was found with the article is they basically observed the effects of young children who had gotten the MMR vaccine and compared that with how many of them, as they got older, got different developmental issues. However, they only looked at, I believe it was between 12 and 15 children total. And it was not a large representative sample, representative as in it wasn't children from many different places, from many different ethnicities, from many different socioeconomic levels, all of these factors that could have very real effects on the health of these children. So it wasn't a very broad representative sample, and it wasn't a very large sample size. It was less than 20 children. So we can pretty confidently say the conclusions that you come to are probably not going to very easily extrapolate over the whole population. If we want accurate information, we want to test in this example, we want to test as many children as we possibly can, certainly more than 12 to 15. Did the researchers adjust for their own bias? We've been talking all about, there's all these different potential issues that we as the reader need to look out for to recognize, like, was there a bias there? Was there a conflict of interest? However, good researchers most of the time will do this for you. And that's not to say you don't have to think about it, but there will be a section in the research article where they will take the time to spell out, we appreciate that this is a potential bias that could have affected our research. And so because of that, we accounted for it in this way, or we changed the experiment in this way. Or we recognize that, these are the calculations we did, and here's the percent chance of error of our calculation. And so there are lots of different ways that researchers can basically recognize they're flawed humans in one way or another, and they can try and account for those things. And the more that the researcher in their article is willing to communicate that information to you, the more likely I am to trust it, because it's a really good sign for me that the researcher knows what they're doing and they are trying their best to avoid bias, which is what we hope for in all of research. Is the research repeatable? Is a really big one, because again, no single discovery by an individual, no single research paper can definitively tell us anything. We certainly don't want to use a single piece of research as the basis, to act as, well, this is truth now, and we all need to adjust how we live accordingly. No, we want that research to be able to be repeated by as many people as possible, because the more times we repeat it, we'll either continue to get the same result over and over again and build a case of saying, yes, this conclusion seems to be very accurate and reliable, or we're going to get totally different results and we're not going to get the same outcome, in which case we can recognize, okay, there is probably some other kind of flaw in the original research. We need to go back and look at it more thoroughly and try and find where the issue is. So research has to be repeatable in order for it to be reliable. And then on top of that, has this research been repeated? How many times has it been repeated? This is unfortunately another issue that can come up in the peer review and publishing system, where because journals and universities and whatever organization is putting out research, they know that they'll get more attention, they'll get more media for exciting new discoveries. On average, they're far less likely to fund research that is just replication of previous studies. This can be a problem because, as I've discussed, the repeatability of research is a crucial aspect of helping us validate the findings of science. If we don't repeat findings that people have had, we can't back them up. We can't, with any accuracy or confidence, say it is a valid conclusion or not. So we need to be able to repeat things, and we need organizations that are willing to fund that research and have it be repeated. And we won't get into those. We've had enough examples. So all of my conclusions here, it's basically the idea. I've talked a lot, I've rambled a lot here. Clearly there's a lot to think about on this topic. But overall, the important thing is not that you have a lot of information. You don't have to be a super smart person that has a lot of knowledge on a lot of different topics to be science literate. Science literacy is about being skeptical, not making assumptions, and being interested in and willing to verify information that is fed to you, regardless of where it comes from. It's about being humble, because we appreciate that we can all be wrong sometimes. It's about trying to recognize confirmation bias within ourselves, where if we have an idea about the world that we really, really believe and we're really set on, of what this is the way that it is, if somebody presents us with an idea or research that does not line up with our idea of the way the world is, confirmation bias is what comes into play, where instead of being totally open to the new idea and being willing to potentially accept, I might be totally wrong and I might need to accept this new idea, confirmation bias would instead be, no, we're too invested in this idea that we have. We're too committed to it. So we're going to come up with some justification for why, no, that new idea doesn't make sense, or it's not valid, or we can't accept it. We want to avoid that. We want to be humble. We always want to be open to, well, it's not just that we could be wrong, it's that everybody could be wrong. It's that, oh, this new research has shed totally new light on this topic, and we all have to change our paradigm now. We all have to change the way that we're thinking. So we always need to be open to new information, and we always need to be open to the ways that that new information could potentially change our world. But if it's changing our world because it's accurate, then I would argue that it's for the better. We need to stay literate. What I mean by this is it's just like normal literacy. If you want to be a really good, proficient reader, you need to read on a regular basis. You need to practice the skill in order to hone it and improve it. And it's the same with science literacy. It can be really overwhelming to go on the website. You know, it feels like you're jumping into the ocean and you're looking for a single grain of sand at the bottom where you're going for hours and hours. And you find the right information. If you do, how do you know that it's reliable? And you have to go and try and source it with other sites. It can seem like a lot. However, you will get better at it with time. It is a practice, it is a skill, and you will get more efficient at it the more that you do it. And also, not just you'll get efficient at knowing how to vet information, but by doing this more as we described, you'll get better, you'll have more confidence in the places that you go for your information. You'll be able to go to a site and say, oh, I trust the information they put on here. Not just because I like them or I like the way that they write, but because I've taken the time in the past to vet this information and see where are they getting this from. And I've validated it enough for myself that I have confidence in them. And as that builds over time, you can much more quickly, well, I don't need to look everywhere on the internet. I can go to these few sites that I know are reliable and I can see what they have to say. At least I can start there. And if I need to go deeper, I can. And again, that you'll create this network of sources over time, and you'll get more confident about how to vet them, how to efficiently vet them. And the other intimidating thing that I found in my own experience was just reading research articles. There's a lot of research articles out there that you get only a couple sentences into them, and then it's totally overwhelming. It doesn't make any sense, but maybe it's a good opportunity to go learn more on that topic, learn something new. So always be striving to get better, always be educating yourself and improving your knowledge of the world. And it will help you verify data that much faster. It will help you get more confident as you go through the world of who's being sincere and accurate with you and who, for whatever reason, is potentially feeding you BS.
Awesome. I feel like that could be a really good place to just,
That's
but
all I got.
yeah, if anybody has any questions, we can stick around for a couple of minutes. We really appreciate y'all taking the time and learning how to be a better consumer of information.
Yeah, thank you. I know there was a lot of rambling, but a lot of ideas.
Not really seeing any questions. I think that was a really great presentation. Thank you so much, Taylor.
Yeah, no problem.
Hope y'all have a good rest of the night, and thank you for coming.
No.